Shalom, friends. Thank you for joining us for a special interview with Rabbi Professor Joshua Berman. We're going to be studying the Tanakh and introducing various personalities and scholars of the Hebrew Bible to you in this new series. And it's an honor to have with us today Rabbi Berman. Thanks for joining us today, Rabbi Berman.
Pleasure. Welcome to all our listeners and viewers abroad.
I'm personally so eager and happy honored really that you're joining us today. I'm a big fan of your writings. I have had this book for many years, your book on the temple, the Beit HaMikdash, its symbolism and meaning then and now. We'll put a link to this book. It's a great book all about the Beit HaMikdash. And I was really excited when your new book just came out. It's called Ani Ma'amin, Biblical Criticism, Historical Truth, and the 13 Principles of Faith. Kind of a controversial, almost sensational title, Rabbi Berman.
Mm-hmm.
Biblical Criticism. You, for those of you who are not familiar, Rabbi Berman is a professor of Tanakh at the Bar Ilan University here in Israel, a graduate of Princeton University and of Yeshivat Har Etzion. Rabbi Berman is the author of 2 academic works on the 5 books of the Torah, and his articles on biblical theology and contemporary society have appeared in the pages of Mosaic magazine and the Wall Street Journal. Rabbi Berman served as a member of the International Advisory Board for the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. I was actually just there last summer with my kids. We had a great time.
Amazing place.
It is an amazing place. So Rabbi Berman, your book is about biblical criticism. And in the beginning, you have a very cute story about a young man who was also a young rabbi who walked over to your house one Shabbat afternoon. He had an Orthodox Jewish upbringing, and he was at a loss. He was brokenhearted because he encountered biblical criticism when I think he was in his 30s, and he didn't know what to make of it, and it really caused a crisis in his faith.
Mm-hmm.
And tell us about that meeting.
Right. Okay, well, let me give a little bit of backdrop about how, why that is. This was such a crisis. Let me explain a little bit for our non-Jewish viewers and listeners. Jews are the people of the book. Jews are, many of them, very intellectual. That said, we have, especially those of us who are traditional Jews, have lived kind of for a very long time in a ghetto. Initially, it was a physical ghetto imposed from the outside. Sometimes it was a ghetto imposed from the inside. Jews did not want to have anything to do with the outside world, lest there be contaminating influences, cultural winds, etc. And so even though Jews have been studying holy texts for thousands of years, the kind of interaction with general culture is a relatively new thing for Jews generally, and particularly for traditionally minded or Orthodox Jews. This is very different than the way it has been for believing Christians. Believing Christians have always done their study of holy texts in a university setting, in a seminary that gives a degree, often together with a university degree. This goes back 1,000 years to the founding of places like Cambridge and Oxford. And so the encounter with critical claims about the Bible, Spinoza and Wellhausen, have been the types of questions that Christians have been exposed to for a very long time. And there, I can say, I have very close brothers in arms, Christian scholars, Bible scholars, from whom I have drawn tremendous inspiration about what it means to be a man of faith on the one hand, with a high view of Scripture, and at the same time unafraid of looking at the critical questions and seeing, how really serious are these questions, is the way in which many people in the university say the stories aren't true, the texts aren't an integral whole. Must it really be that way? Or are there ways to undermine those claims? Are there other equally valid scholarly claims? This is a type of endeavor that Christians have been doing for 1,000 years and which Jews have been doing for maybe a decade. And so I've gotten incredible inspiration from my Christian brothers, my Christian colleagues in the academy. And so when this young man came over to my house, this is a fellow who's American, but who had probably never had any exposure to any of the questions about the Bible that come from the university. And today, it used to be that this wasn't a problem because who really knew a whole lot about biblical criticism? I recall when I was studying in yeshiva in the 1980s, and I heard that there were some fellows in the yeshiva who were interested in biblical criticism. And I thought to myself, how do they even know about that? To learn about this stuff, you would have to, I was in Israel at the time, you'd have to get on a bus and travel for an hour to a big library and find the book, if you even knew what it was, and start to read. I mean, that's a huge effort. But today, you don't have to get on a bus. You don't have to go to a library. In fact, you don't even make any effort, and it comes crashing in. The waves come over your laptop and over your screen, and it's right all over you. Because just sit there, and if you do this enough times, biblical criticism comes up, whether you're an atheist or whether you're a believer. And so everybody now is confronted with these questions, including traditional Jews. And so therefore, it's the right time for us to begin to roll up our sleeves and see what we can do.
So you would expect that after, with biblical criticism so easily acceptable, and all of the experts and the academics proving that the Bible is a myth and a fantasy, you would expect so many observant and faithful Jews and Christians to abandon their tradition and abandon their
And many do,
loyalty.
and many do.
And many do. Is that what you found? Have you found that the accessibility of biblical criticism has provided to be a challenge to the faith?
I think so. I mean, and I'm sure that our Christian viewers will echo the same sentiment. When people abandon the tradition, whether it's our tradition, Rabbi Weiss, or whether it's a faith-bound Christian tradition, be it evangelical, be it Catholic, whatever it might be, it is rare. It happens sometimes, but it is rare that there's someone who comes with full faith and then suddenly encounters intellectual arguments, and those by themselves are what sway the person to leave the faith. It's often a lot of acculturation. It's just being surrounded by norms and ways of thinking that are somewhat inimical to traditional views of things. And then once a person is all a little bit halfway out the door, coming across, seemingly very valid. The questions are very valid. The questions are real questions. And say, gosh, well, if my teachers, whether they're Jewish for Jewish day school kids, or whether they are Christian for Christian kids, my teachers never told me about any of this stuff. So I guess they have nothing to say. Then it's almost to be expected that people who are kind of wavering culturally will then, engage this stuff and say, see, it's not doing it for me. It's not doing it for me. And I'm out the door. So, we have a lot of people. There's some people who've left, and this is true for Jews and Christians. There are people who kind of waver. There are people who might still be connected to tradition, but they've been hollowed out inside because they don't really believe anymore in the tenets of the tradition, but they like the lifestyle, the community, etc. So it's a whole range of people on a spectrum.
But what I really appreciate with your book, the Ani Maamin specifically, was that it really reconciles and answers those tough questions. Because you're right, the traditional Jewish approach doesn't ask necessarily, doesn't have the same assumptions as the academy, but often does ask the same kinds of questions and comes up with different kinds of answers. However, in recent decades, there's a whole lot of new evidence that has emerged through other studies, other fields, and through archaeology. And so what's really exciting in the Tanakh community right now is scholars like yourself who are really at the forefront of reconciling this new approach and studying Tanakh with all of this new evidence. And so but you don't shy away from the questions, and but you also at the same time certainly don't reject the tradition. Now, we both live in Beit Shemesh, where there's so much archaeology in our literally in our backyard.
Yes, there is.
And and can you tell us a little bit about how archaeology has, in recent decades, or even in recent centuries, but in a relatively short amount of time,
Hmm.
has changed the way that the traditional community views the Bible?
Well, I mean, the truth is that for many members in the traditional community, Orthodox community, these issues don't come up. The more right wing, what we call ultra Orthodox or Haredi community, by and large, still don't have any interest in these questions. Though more and more, I get lots of emails all the time from people, with long black coats and black hats, and they just they can't get enough of these questions and these types of answers. I would say that the most significant archaeological discoveries in like the last decade or so, 10 to 15 years, has been substantiation of the existence of a King David with a large kingdom, which there've been kind of missing pieces to that have now been corroborated by finds at several sites. That's what you had in mind.
And so, how do you view archaeology or biblical archaeology? Do you see it as being evidence that what we read in the Torah is true, or not necessarily?
Right.
Or
Right.
how do you reconcile
Okay,
biblical
I
archaeology?
don't see anything in the archaeological record that would dissuade a rational thinking person from affirming the basic trajectory of what the Hebrew Bible tells us. There is nothing in archaeology that should disprove the existence of three patriarchs whose descendants went down to Egypt, who were liberated en masse, who returned to the land of Israel and engaged in the conquest of the land. Now, that said, not everything can be corroborated by archaeology. What are you going to find about Abraham? You know what I mean? I mean, the guy had some sheep, I mean, what are you going to find? Droppings? I mean, there's not a whole lot that one can find about individuals. Um, 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 I think there's plenty about the Exodus. And everybody agrees that there is evidence of a conquest of what archaeologists call the hill country, what we call in biblical terms the areas, the ancestral tribal lands of Manasseh and Ephraim, Samaria today, and Judea. There's evidence of very large new settlements all over the hill region there, with no idols and with no pig bones, and this seems to also fall in line largely with the idea of a conquest at that time. So I don't see a whole lot in the archaeological record that would go against the Bible.
Okay, but would you take it? How much further would you take it? Would you say that archaeology proves the Bible is true?
In some areas, yes. In some areas, the record isn't clear, and very often the findings are open to interpretation. So it depends. We'd have to look at a particular issue, a particular story, a particular period.
Okay, so now you mentioned, like, what are we going to find from the era of the patriarchs? And in fact, there's not a lot of biblical archaeology from the era of the patriarchs. However, when it comes to Exodus, we would expect to find evidence or archaeological evidence. Certainly, 600,000 people or men in the desert, all in a very concentrated area. We would expect, or at least I'm not an expert, but what I've read is that they would expect,
Mm-hmm.
and there isn't a lot or any maybe uh, evidence of the 600,000 Jews in the wilderness.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm asking you.
Right. So in the wilderness, no. In my book, as you know, Rabbi White's the issue of how we relate to numbers in the Hebrew Bible is a whole discussion. The symbolism, the use of numbers in ancient Eastern literature, and in the Bible can be demonstrated to often be symbolic. That doesn't mean that it's not true. It means that you have to know how to read it properly. And I claim there that the 600,000 also needs to be understood in that light. So the question isn't the number of people that comes out. The question is there any evidence of any type of exodus, of any size, of any sort? And you know, you can't blame people who say, listen, there's just no positive evidence. And when they say that, they're not totally making it up, because there truly is no mention of a Moses anywhere in Egyptian records, no mention of Israelites, no mention of Hebrews, no mention of plagues, at least in an explicit way, no mention of slaves upping and leaving. You know, there's this, I don't know why, there's this YouTube video of a wheel in water, and people get really excited about that. I don't know what that demonstrates, that someone found a wheel in water. You know, presumably from a chariot in the Red Sea. No, it doesn't cut it for me, that's for sure. However, I think that there is good evidence for the Exodus. You just have to know where to look for it. See, the problem, as I see it, is that people say, well, we have to look for evidence of what it says in the Torah, in the records of Egypt, and it's hard to find that. But there's another way to go about it, and that is to look for references in the Torah for what we know about Egypt. And when you look at that carefully, what you find is that there's tons of evidence, tons of amazing parallels to texts and ways of expression and ways of thought that were predominant at a very specific time in Egypt. And when you look at it that way, then suddenly you can see that what the Torah is doing in grand fashion is what is called cultural appropriation. Let me give one small example of this. We're all familiar with the phrase, in the biblical phrase, that the Almighty took Israel out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Okay? Now, you know, I guess most of us just sort of say, well, that's a trope, that's a metaphor. God doesn't have an arm and a hand, though many believing Jews and Christians in the Middle Ages really thought God had an arm and a hand. But we would say, no, that's just a way of expressing the Almighty's strength. It's really nothing more than that, but it is more than that. Let me explain. There's something a little bit unusual about that phrase, mighty hand and outstretched arm, and that is that one might have expected to find that throughout the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, that any time that the Almighty performs a miracle, that Scripture would say, and there goes the Almighty with his mighty hand and his outstretched arm. And yet what we find is that this phrase is used exclusively, almost exclusively, with regard to the events of the Exodus. And there's a reason for that. And that is that when we look in inscriptions about the pharaohs from what's called the Egyptian New Kingdom, that's 1500 to 1200 BCE, which is a period that would conform to these traditional Jewish accounts of when the enslavement in Egypt took place. What you find is that almost everything that's said about the pharaohs says, and the pharaoh bagged 100 elephants with his mighty hand and his outstretched arm. Or the pharaoh conquered the Libyans with his mighty hand and his outstretched arm. And on and on. Everything is attributed to the pharaoh's mighty hand and outstretched arm. And then you see that the Torah says, God takes Israel out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. This is a prime example of cultural appropriation. The idea is that when an oppressed people, one way of engaging in cultural warfare against their oppressors is to steal their thunder, is to take their symbols and make them their own and use them against their oppressors. And this is what the Torah is doing by saying, you want to know who's got a real mighty hand and an outstretched arm? It ain't Pharaoh, it's the Almighty. And he's taking Israel out of Egypt and using the royal Egyptian propaganda against the Pharaoh himself. And this happens all over the book of Exodus, examples like this. And that's where I think we can see the evidence for some type of liberation from Egypt at that time.
Wait, so the evidence would be that we see that phrase used at the same time to describe the Pharaoh?
That's right. And yeah, that's just one small piece of the puzzle, but there are many, many other pieces as well. Yeah.
So in your book, in your chapter about the Exodus, the evidence and the scholarship, you bring a lot of very fascinating examples. So an example, I'd love to just run through a few of them here. You bring evidence that there was a Semitic population living in the Eastern Nile Delta, right? What the Torah describes as Goshen.
Okay, yeah, yeah.
We have evidence of that there was sort of a external group that was living in the area that the Torah describes.
Yeah, though that's hardly remarkable. That is to say, there are many Egyptian records throughout the second millennium BCE that describe people from what they called Asia, which is to say Eretz Canaan, the land of Canaan, coming down to Egypt during famines. This is what happened. Just as the Torah says, Abraham went down and Jacob went down. So this was a recurring event. That by itself is not so remarkable. Yeah.
Okay, but it certainly coincides with the way that the Torah describes.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, and then the cities that the Torah refers to, Pitom and Ramses,
Mm-hmm.
are also, there's evidence of those cities that at the time.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay. You bring an example about how that the title Pharaoh was used only at that time to describe the king of Egypt.
Calling someone Pharaoh by himself, as opposed to Pharaoh, like if I were to just say, if I were to refer to you as Rabbi, as opposed to Rabbi Whites or Rabbi Tully.
Mm-hmm.
Not to confuse pharaohs and rabbis, but yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So later on in the Tanakh, where it will refer to
Pharaoh Necho. Yeah.
But at the time it would only refer to Pharaoh. Okay.
Right. This is one of the things that helps us date biblical texts in a reliable way. Meaning, let's put aside faith, okay? How would you know when a text is from, or how would you know when something that a biblical text says, when that idea originated within Am Yisrael? And the answer is, if it's something that someone living centuries later couldn't have known about, then you say, so that must have seeped in back then. So this idea that pharaohs were called just Pharaoh, as opposed to Pharaoh Necho or Rabbi Whites or Professor Berman, this is something that someone living centuries later would not have known about. So that might suggest the Torah is from this earlier period.
Okay. Your next example is a fascinating one. So it's from the Song at the Sea in Exodus chapter 15, verses 1 through 18. So it refers to, it's very fascinating, and I've always wondered this, that they've just gone through the 10 plagues and the Exodus, and now they've gone through the water, the splitting of the sea, and Moses leads the men in song, and Miriam leads the women in song, and then all of a sudden, so they start singing about the destruction of Edom and the tribes of Moab and the dwellers of Canaan are aghast. And, what's going on here? Why is it describing all of these other nations? Mm-hmm. And you use this as evidence of the Exodus?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is my prime example of cultural appropriation. That there was, in the time of Ramses II, Ramses the Great, who ruled for most of the 13th century BCE. His greatest achievement was that he was victorious over the Hittites, who lived in Anatolia, who lived in basically modern-day Turkey. And he had a battle with them at a place called Kadesh, which is on the Lebanese-Syrian border. And at the Battle of Kadesh, scholars think that was the largest chariot battle in all of history. And when Ramses came back from Egypt, he plastered Egypt with accounts of this battle. So many that it makes the Battle of Kadesh the most publicized event in all of ancient history, Egypt, Greece, Rome, wherever. In other words, like the Ark of Titus. There's one Ark of Titus, right? One place that has a depiction of the sacking of Jerusalem in 70 CE. But Ramses the Great, we know of at least 10 different places where he put up accounts of what happened at the Battle of Kadesh. And when you read that story of what he says happened there, it follows step by step. It's step by step the same as the events that happen as Israel flees from Egypt, is chased by chariots, a pillar of fire comes down and separates Israel from Egypt. The Egyptians chase the Israelites into the water. They get drowned. Then the Israelites sing a song of praise. All of these things are paralleled in what we call the Kaddish poem. And it's so the language is so similar that there has to be some connection here. And my claim is that what's happening here is that the Torah, because Israel was enslaved in Egypt at that time to Ramses the Great, and because these Kaddish inscriptions were so ubiquitous and well known, they were used to indoctrinate even common people. We have evidence of that as well. That when the Torah wanted to give a sense of how great the Almighty is, because Israel couldn't see him directly or hear him directly, the way in which the Torah did this was saying, here, look, we're going to orchestrate an event, the Exodus and particularly the crossing of the sea, that in so many ways is going to parallel what the Kaddish inscriptions say happened at the Battle of Kadesh, including the enemies drowning in water. And including the troops singing a song of praise with many similar phrases in it, demonstrate that what the Almighty is doing here is out-pharaohing the Pharaoh. That what we're doing is appropriating the propaganda of the greatest Pharaoh of all time and using it against him to celebrate a liberation of Israelites from Egypt. And maybe the best evidence of this is stuff that I didn't discover. This was already in the 30s they came up with this, that the tabernacle seems to be remarkably similar to the drawings that we have of Ramses' camp at Kadesh. In other words, he has like bas reliefs of what his throne tent looked like. And it looks just like the tabernacle. The dimensions are the same. And it's a camp surrounded by military encampments, just like the Mishkan, the tabernacle was. Israel is arranged around same order, same direction, same orientation. And all of this is to drive home the point that the Almighty is even greater than Ramses II, that we are out-pharaohing the Pharaoh, that we are culturally appropriating propaganda of the greatest achievement of the greatest Pharaoh, greatest kingdom of the ancient world.
Okay, can we run through some other examples?
Okay.
All right. I like the next one. It talks about how the stories of the Exodus and the Israelites' wanderings in the wilderness reflect sound acquaintance with the geography and the natural conditions of the Eastern Nile Delta, the Sinai, and the Negev, and the Transjordan. Meaning what? That it's clear that that it wasn't written later. It's clear.
Right. In other words, yeah. What Scripture says at the end of the beginning of chapter 14, which is the end of chapter 13, is that when Israel came out of Egypt, it says that God did not want to send them the shortest route. The shortest route, if you're coming out of the Nile Delta and heading east, the shortest route to get to the Holy Land is to go along the coast, right? You follow the top of the Sinai Peninsula and enter the land that way. That would have been the shortest way to go. And what the Torah says is that Hashem did not want to take Israel that way because it would be clear that they would encounter fortresses along the way. They would encounter resistance militarily, Egyptian military resistance. Now, it just so happens that Ramses actually did have a whole series of fortifications that ran along the coast. And so what the Torah is saying there fits with what we know about how he had situated his forces along the northern coast of the Sinai. Now, some scholars want to claim that all of this stuff was written, many centuries later. But how would someone who would have lived many centuries later have known that Ramses had those fortifications there? So that's another example of, just simply, this helps us date the text when you have things that you had to have been there to know it.
Okay.
Or if you weren't there, you had to have been a 21st century archaeologist who dug all this stuff up.
Right. So speaking of digging stuff up, you talk about how they dug up a lot of stuff and they found a lot of bones, but they didn't find pig bones in the settlement areas that we would expect the Bnei Israel, the Jewish people, to have lived at the time.
Right.
So
Right.
what, they found other bones, just not pig bones? And what does that
Yeah,
demonstrate?
that's right. Yeah. In other words, they found deer, they found goats, things like that, livestock, some cows, no pigs.
So they kept a kosher diet. The people who lived
Well,
there
it
at
would
the time.
appear. It would appear. And we know that indigenous peoples in Eretz Canaan did domesticate pigs.
Hmm. Hmm. That's very fascinating. And then
Hmm.
finally, this is a very strong example that the word Israel, the name Israel, is
Hmm.
actually found around this time period.
Right. The first reference to Israel outside of the Bible, I'm saying, in the archaeological record, is in something called the Merneptah Stela. Merneptah was the pharaoh that reigned immediately after Ramses II. This is towards the end of the 13th century BCE. And he has, as many pharaohs did, a victory stela. To what degree his victories really happened the way he said, we don't know. But this is what he says. He says, I went on a campaign in the land of Canaan. And by the way, Canaan, Eretz Canaan, that term is an Egyptian term. And the Torah uses the Egyptian term for this part of the land. That's also part of it. In fact, the borders of Eretz Canaan are exactly the borders that Egyptian sources give for the land of Canaan. This is just part of the cultural literacy that the Torah has with how ancient Egypt worked. All the measurements in the Torah are Egyptian measurements. But getting back to the Merneptah Stela, so Merneptah says, I went on a campaign to the land of Canaan, and I conquered everybody. And there's a long list of kings and little principalities that he claims that he laid waste to. And then he says, and I also laid waste Israel. Israel is no more. His seed is laid waste. I think that's the precise translation that he has there. And what's interesting is that the way in which Israel is written suggests that it's not a settled town, but a wandering people. And that might fit with the fact that, when children of Israel first enter the land of Canaan, as we know from the book of Joshua and the book of Judges, they don't conquer everything all at once. It takes a long time until they get settled. And so this could be a reference to Israel during this time when they are already in the land partially, but not yet fully settled. That's 1206 BCE. That's the first reference that we have to Israel outside of the Bible.
Amazing, amazing. So all of this, you also write in your chapter that is to help the father on the Pesach night at the Passover Seder,
Mm-hmm.
help explain to his son. The son at the Passover Seder looks to his father and he asks, why is this night different than all other nights?
Mm-hmm.
And the father has to answer. So just to sum everything up, how does all of your scholarship and your research on the Exodus help the father at the Passover Seder answer, why is this night different than all of the other
Well,
nights?
because when the son says, Abba, Daddy, I saw on the internet that there's never an Exodus and that there's no evidence for it. So this gives quite an answer for that, and I think that it just suggests that there was some great event that happened there, in which the greatest pharaoh was defeated, and somehow Israel was liberated. So that's can't ask for more than that.
That's amazing. And that's all based on research in recent decades. We're looking forward
Mm-hmm.
to seeing what is unearthed in the coming years
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and in reading more of your books. So I highly recommend everybody to check out Ani Mamin on the historical truth in the academic research that helps understand and appreciate the truth of the Bible. And then, of course, the temple. Rabbi Berman, what are some of the other books?
Oh gosh. I mean, I have two other academic books. Well, one of them, the Ani Mamin is actually a kind of a lay version of my previous book, which was an academic book, which was called Inconsistency in the Torah, Ancient Literary Convention, and the Limits of Source Criticism. And it tackles the very serious question that many people ask, many academics ask, and they say, it looks like there are a lot of inconsistencies and contradictions in the Torah. Contradictions about the stories in the Torah, they're told several times in different ways. Contradictions about the laws of the Torah. And that book is put out by Oxford, 2017, is an attempt to demonstrate how, yes, these appear to modern eyes to be contradictions. But when you look at how people wrote in ancient times, then you understand that these were deliberate literary conventions. And these help us understand the Torah in a much deeper way.
Amazing, amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Rabbi Berman, thank you so much
Okay.
for this wonderful conversation.
All right. Rabbi Weiss, thank you. And blessings from the Holy Land to all of our viewers abroad.
Shalom.
Okay.